tonight. The nation talks to Billy Kay. Billy is an award-winning author, renowned for books such as The Mother Tongue I mentioned, and also the Scottish World about Scots diaspora. If you want to know more about Billy's books, you'll see them shown at the bottom of the screen. You can go to Billy's website, which is www.billyk.scot, and you can engage with Billy. I mean, this is exciting stuff. I mean, how often do you get a chance to be in touch with the author direct? You should take full advantage of this. Billy joins us from Newport. How are you, Billy? How are you coping with the pandemic?
Totally scunnered like everybody else who's been fallen the past 3 months. But the end is nigh. The end is nigh. So I'm looking forward to getting out and about. Starting in the next few weeks, I think we'll be out and about quite a bit.
Well, that's great. I'm looking forward personally to a haircut.
Absolutely, me too.
I've got an incipient ponytail behind me.
Oh no! Oh, mullets, never.
Tell us, Billy, about your background, because you're not from Newport. You're from Galston, is that right? In Ayrshire.
I'm originally an Ayrshire man. Spent the first 18 years of my life in Galston, or Goston, as it's called locally, Irvine Valley, Galston, Yamills and Darvel, or Goston, Yamills and Dervel in the Scots vernacular. And 1950s, post-war, 1951 I was born, so we were the last of the pre-television generations. And that had an important effect because we very much lived in a Scottish village, a Scottish wee town, rather than a global village. The only outside influence was the pictures. Yeah, you went to the picture house, the Geggy is what it's called, the Goston Geggy. And you saw Elvis's movies with your big sisters and things like that. But most of the time, you were living in a very Scottish environment. Scots-speaking, working class, 90% of the people spoke Scots 90% of the time. And that was the world that you knew. And it was a very safe, loving environment. And I identify strongly with that place I came from ever since.
There must have been some dissonances, though. I mean, what happened when you went to school? Did everyone at school talk Scots?
When the teacher wasn't around, everybody spoke the way they did to their mother and father and grandparents. But there was a thing that you knew almost, you knew physically that if you spoke the vernacular once you went to school, that you might be given the belt, given the toss, and the toss was still on the go. The famous Lochgelly strap was still on the go in the 1950s. So you learned for a guy early age to switch. And fortunately, I was good at language, always have been, and was able to make the switch. Whereas some of my classmates, I would say, found it harder to make the switch and were punished for that. Were told basically their culture was worthless. And the people they came from was worthless. And culture in their country was worthless. And some people would say that's an exaggeration, but looking back, I think a lot of people switched off their education because there was nothing of their culture reflected back at them. I mean, I say in the Mother Tongue book that, we get Burns's poetry, one day a year we recite it. Tam O'Shanter, for example, which I learned eventually. I had to recite bits of it for the Burns Prize. One day a year, then you get the belt the other 364 days if you spoke his language. And these are the kind of anomalies and ironies that growing up in Scotland, that people experience. But counter to that, with a very, very positive, my mother and father were natural cultural nationalists, even though politically there was nothing on the go at the time. But my dad brought me up with stories of Burns and Wallace and Bruce. And Galston, for example, was a place that was thrang, poaching with streets from the days of the Wars of Independence. The Bruce was in the Bar Castle in Galston. My granny stayed in a street called Standalane Street. And the legend there is that Wallace's men, hearing that a big English force was coming to try and capture him, run away, he's supposed to have said, I stand alone. So stand alone was where Aunt Kay lived. And there was a place in the River Irvine where I used to go walking and swimming as a wee boy. And there was places there where stories about Wallace catching fish and his fish being stolen by the English soldiers were part of the folklore and the oral tradition. So although you weren't given a lot of official Scottish history, you got a lot from your background. And my mum went to the library all the time. She read the great classics of literature. And my dad did this. And although he was a charge hand in Massey Ferguson and Kilmarnock, my mum did wee cleaning jobs here and there. In a way, they both came with me when I eventually went to university and read the books that I was reading. I studied Scottish literature and American literature. After beginning doing a language degree, I switched. And in a way, they came with me. And my dad deliberately tried to read the books that I was reading. And I remember him saying that about the only two books he said he couldn't fathom were William Faulkner's, I think it was His Eye Lying, and James Joyce's Ulysses. Now, these are hard books.
That's hard. That's hard work.
Hard work. They're hard work. But my dad tried, and these were the only ones I remember him struggling with. So, although it was a working class ex-mining town, the pits had been closed in the 1920s, but the atmosphere was still, growing up in the 50s and 60s, a lot of Goston men still worked in Mauchline and Sorn and when doing the pit. And that was part of the culture too. And another influence, for example, when I was a wee boy, I was handed over the hedge in Loudon Avenue, over the fence to Annie Murray, this wonderful lady who influenced me a lot. And Annie was for a strong Roman Catholic background. And that's another myth I'd love to destroy about sectarianism rife everywhere in the west of Scotland. Scotland's shame. Absolute garbage. The people who were sectarian where I came from were regarded as scum. They were regarded as scum by the respectable Protestant working class. And my best friends were the Murrays round the corner, who were staunch Roman Catholics, had images of the saints all over their house. And when Annie was babysitting me a couple of times, she took me to the chapel in Goston. So sectarianism was 1,000 miles from my culture growing up in Ayrshire. And Annie had gone to Glasgow University, but had to give up because she had to come home and look after her brothers who were minors, and had to fend for them and cook for them and things like that. But she brought back her books from Glasgow. So when I started doing languages at the age of 12 and 13, Annie had a wee collection of livres de poche, pocket books by Hachette, the French publisher. And I started reading Molière and Racine at the age of 13 in a council scheme in Goston because Annie had the books. And that sounds like tales from Scheherazade to some people, I'm guys sure. But in Bow Hill in West Fife, which was my other family contact, because we were a mixed family, one was Ayrshire and one was Fife. My mother grew up in Fife. Her dad was a miner. And in Bow Hill, there was a thing called the People's Burns Club, which is still in Bow. It's full of working class intellectuals. And people like Hugh McDermott used to go there every year for the Burn Supper and discuss communist politics, which was very strong in the little Moscows of West Fife. Discuss communist politics with working class folk in the schemes in Bow Hill. So it's as if all life was concentrated in these villages at that time. There was nothing narrow and provincial and cut off from the world, although it still was a strongly Scottish environment.
And when you talked about reading Molière, did you read it in the original French?
I did, yeah. They were in French. They were in French.
So you were reading French at what, 13, 14?
Yeah,
is it?
I was able to decipher it, and again, this is the irony that we'll go on to talk about the mother tongue. The irony is that the prevailing wisdom in education was that at that time was kill off the children's native dialects of Scots and try and get them to be monoglot English speakers, and that'll help them go on in the world. Whereas everybody since then knows that the way that people go on in the world if they speak several languages. And if you speak two languages, Scots and English, that's as good a start as any to becoming multilingual. And the reason I found it easy later to speak French and German, and I married my beautiful wife, Maria, as well, and learned Portuguese. I studied higher Russian at Kilmarnock Academy, etc., etc. The reason I was good at these languages was I was brought up bilingual in Scots and English. So there was nothing narrow about that experience whatsoever.
So, I mean, that's really interesting. What do you think the rationale was for the environment and the atmosphere that you found at school? I mean, what was the logic? What was the rationale to saying to people your culture is inferior? Because once you got to university, that's the time you probably can look back and say, who decided this? Who thought this was a good idea? Did you ever establish who that might be or what that might be?
Well, it was just a gradual process of Anglicisation that took place mainly from the Union onwards, where first of all the aristocrats and then percolating down the middle classes thought that they had to make it in an English environment to get on. And gradually that affected the whole of the society. So the idea that you ditch your native culture because it's not going to be advantageous in this English-dominated world that you're moving in, and English-dominated circles that you're moving in. In other words, it's a kind of cultural colonization. It's people looking over their shoulder to have models of how to behave. And it's been in Scottish society since people call it the Scottish cringe. The Catalans call it the slave mentality of people who are cowed and can only think of themselves in a British or, say, Spanish context rather than a Catalan or Scottish context. So that affects people, and it's been there for a long, long time. There's a story that's in the mother tongue about the linguistic dilemma and dichotomy, the pull in the two directions that a lot of people felt in the 18th century. And there was a young aristocrat called John Clerk of Pennycook, and he was pleading a Scots appeal case in England, in London, and I think it was taken in the House of Lords, which he mentioned earlier. And the young lawyer was talking about his client having rocht their lands aside this water for over 300 years, and the other farmer, the other side of the water, wants to steal a whank out his grun, talking in Scots, pleading in Scots. And the English judge who presided decided he would interrupt and say, "Mr. Clark, in Scotland, do you spell water with two T's?" And Clerk thought for a minute and then said, "No, my lord, but we spell manners with two N's." Now, he had the ability to reply to that garbage. Most Scots are that cowed. A bit like Boswell when he was introduced to Dr. Johnson said, "Oh, I do indeed come from Scotland, but I cannot help it." So you've got that strange mixture of pride and prejudice and glory and vainglory and pulling in different directions, and the cringe versus the pride that's been in Scottish society really since the 18th century, since the Union, I would say.
Well, it still exists, because I do recall that quite recently when Ruth Davidson had a dinner perhaps with Margaret Thatcher, she started her remarks by saying, "Well, since we've got Scots here tonight, you need to lock up your silver."
Mm,
Uh,
mm.
yeah, I've never quite understood the rationale and the logic of that. But anyway, that seems to be indicative of the same sort of
Yes,
mentality.
yeah.
We've had a question. It's an interesting question, and thank you, Hashbody Stumble, for this on YouTube. The question is, we'd be interested, which, if any, Scots words have been incorporated into English?
Ah, right. Yeah, interesting. Well, at one time, Scots and English shared a lot of vocabulary. They still do share a lot of vocabulary. I always say that if an Anglian tribesman from the 9th century could time travel into modern Britain, he would find it impossible to understand Boris Johnson, but he would understand me, because I still say dún and tún, I still say nicht and recht, I still say blate, I still say reek, words that were common Anglo-Saxon, Old English and Old Scots words, but have died out of Standard English. So funnily enough, Scots retains an older form of English in some ways. But as far as words are concerned, some interesting ones that you might not even think of as Scots words, because a lot of words are Scots and we use them in particularly Scots ways, but people don't recognise them as Scots. During the 18th century, there were lists of Scoticisms to be avoided. And it was expressions like to let on was one to be avoided. There's a famous story about Pitt the Younger being asked by a Scottish politician if he could borrow a horse the length of the Highgate, and him replying, "We don't possess a steed quite as long as the one that you've requested." But is that the length of? I'll see the length of the bus stop. There's a lot of expressions like that are Scots, and we use them, but some people don't realise they're Scots. But interesting words that went into English from Scots are things like Walter Scott introduced a number of words into English through the popularity of his novels. The word freelance, for example. Freelance refers to the freelances among the border reivers, the people who could be hired out to follow whichever riding clan was riding and reiving that particular time. And another expression that came out of the border reivers is blackmail. To blackmail somebody. Blackmail. There was white mail, which was silver, money, and there was blackmail, which was cattle. And if you wanted the reivers not to reave you and steal your cattle, you paid them in blackmail, which was black cattle. You paid them, you gave them a few cattle a year, and then they wouldn't steal all your cattle. So we invented blackmail, I'm afraid, and they come into the English language from Walter Scott. Another word is glamour, which is a great word. You think of Marilyn Monroe as being glamorous. Well, Walter Scott introduced that old Scots word of glamour, meaning where you're enchanted almost by a fairy or something like that. And that came into English from Scotland, via Walter Scott. So there's a lot of interesting words like that.
Yeah, I used to find it fascinating. I lived in the States for a bit, and it always struck me that Americans used words that maybe because the language got separated from English back in 1776 or thereabouts. Somehow that Scottish part of English, which perhaps was current then, stayed in the US for a good deal longer because there was no need to alter it, I suspect.
That's right. What were the words you were thinking of?
Yeah, oh, gracious! I was busy racking my brains there. Just Americans would they would say
one is to hunker. We talk about in Scots going down in your hunkers, and the Americans talk about hunkering down.
Hunkering down, and they also talk about waiting on something.
That's right.
Not waiting for.
I think to let on is used in America too. In the Deep South, in the Carolinas and Virginia and places like that, where you've got a strong Lowland Scots and Ulster Scots admixture, they use words like a poke for a bag, and to red up, to clear up. Yeah. You'll hear that in the Carolinas. They call it about a cotton poke, a cotton bag, for example. So you get that sometimes because of Scots, and for example, in Appalachia, until the 20th century, if you wanted to flag the bairns, to frighten the wains, you said, wheesht ye, dinna fret ye, Claver hoose, he willna get ye. And that refers to Graham of Claverhouse, who was the man who attacked the Covenanters in the 17th century. Yeah. And when the Scots went from Lowland, from Ayrshire and Covenanting territory and Ulster to America, there were some Scots who fought in Italy, and there's a myth about them stopping in a wee alpine village and them wearing the tartan, but it really is mostly mythological. But there is there's an apocryphal story like that you get in the East, where the forces of Islam, the Turks, were moving north to attack Christendom, and the Poles were defending it somewhere in the Ukraine. And 2 diplomats were sent out to negotiate a ceasefire. And they used the language of diplomacy, which was French. But when they had agreed the ceasefire, one turned to the other and said, "Wheel, Jordi, fusaier fauken in veruri." And that's an apocryphal story, and there's several versions of that. But there's a true version of that, which is even more incredible. And I have to thank my friend Steve Murdoch at St Andrews University for this story, because he's the one who's done a lot of work about the Scots in Scandinavia. And in the Peace of Kalmar, I think it was about 1613, there was a war between Denmark, Norway on one side and Sweden on the other. And the men who negotiated the peace were James Spence of Wormiston in the East Neuk of Fife on one side, and his half-brother, Robert Anstruther, from the East Neuk of Fife. They literally kent each other's father. They had the same father, and they were representing both sides as diplomats, and hugely influential in Denmark and in Sweden at that time, as were a lot of Scots in Northern Europe because of the big migration to Northern Europe, to Poland and Prussia and Germany, etc., especially in the 17th century. Huge influence there.
I heard, in fact, I went to a lecture once, last year at the Central Library in Edinburgh, and there was a Polish group there who were telling a story about the wealthiest man in Poland at one time who was Scottish.
Yes, that was Robert Porteous.
Porteous, that's right. Yeah, absolutely.
He was into wine as I am to this day. He made his fortune selling Tokaj wine, this lovely fortified sweet wine from Hungary, selling all over Northern Europe. And in Krosno, the town, he endowed a church in Krosno. And they still have, I think they have a festival dedicated to him. And he was hugely wealthy in that period. But then you've got up in northern Poland, you had an organisation called the Scottish Brotherhood. In German it was called die Schottische Bruderschaft, the Scottish Brotherhood, and it had 12 branches across the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And it was full of merchants who then brought over boys from Dundee and Aberdeen. I'm looking over the tay myself just now. Boys would take ship from Dundee and go to Königsberg and Gdansk, Danzig, cities like that. And the wealthy Scots merchants gave them peddlers' packs and sent them out, like the fish van for Pitt and Weem that comes to my door, send them out to deliver directly to the peasantry in the Polish countryside. Yeah. And that's how they operated, and hugely successful. And they were so ubiquitous, so common in that period, that there was a saying in German. I mentioned Claverhouse as the bogeyman for the Appalachians. Well, in Poland and Prussia at that time, it was the Scot. And the word for a peddler and a Scot was often the same, der Schotte. And there's a German proverb, warte bis der Schotte kommt. You wait till the Scot comes and takes you away. In other words, if a Wayne was gieing the mither jip, she would threaten the Wayne with the Scots coming like the raggle-taggle gypsies and stealing the Wayne and taking them away. We were so much the other at that time. And the German authorities who were in the towns began to bring legislation against the Scots because they were stealing money from the German middle classes at that time. So fascinating stuff.
Tell us about the Scots who went to Argentina and introduced the folks there to football.
Football, well, they introduced football practically everywhere. I've got Scottish missionaries from Malawi to China taking football with them. And it was the Scottish passing game that they took, which was the original, which is the game we now play rather than the kick and rush dribbling style of football that emerged in Eton and Harrow in the English public schools. So it was our game that's the modern game of football, definitely. It definitely was us that invented that style of football. In South America, it was often tied in with the railways. Scottish engineers working on taking the railways and the railway lines around South America, and they took with them their game of football. Then Argentina, there's a particular man who was a Glaswegian called Alexander Watson Hutton, and there's a library dedicated to his honour in Buenos Aires in the Argentine Football Federation, and he was the man who really founded Argentine football. He organised the first international match with Uruguay. He organised the first league, and the very first, I think it was the first or the second league competition in Argentina. It was Old Caledonians versus St Andrews FC in a playoff to win the first Argentine championship, and that was how deeply involved they were. And I was delighted to see that, I think it's the St Andrews team continued as, I didn't know that when I wrote the book actually, these things take wings and fly. The St Andrews team became Independence, which is a great name for any football club. And they brought out a third strip this year with a big St Andrews cross in it. It was in some of the newspapers. I tweeted about it a couple of weeks ago. So that tradition continues. They know exactly who taught them to play football. And one of their most famous players was a guy called Dave Harley. And he went to Uruguay and played for Peñarol in Uruguay. And everybody raved about his style of football. And he became very influential in Uruguay. While up in Sao Paulo, it was Boys v Paisley with Coates Clark, who established a thread mill in Sao Paulo and imported weavers and Fitba players. And Charlie Miller was one of the pioneers there. And then there was a boy McLean who played for the Paisley football team. There's a photograph in my book of the Scottish Wanderers, which was the name of the team in Sao Paulo. And they were big influence in developing our style of football in Brazil.
Isn't that amazing? So that's Argentina, that's Brazil. Were there any other teams in South America or Latin America? This is a subject that's expanded tremendously. There is a book, I helped initially a chap, I can't remember his name off the top, but Lewis Press brought out an expanded version of the chapters in my book. And so now there's a lot of work, and they're discovering teams in Mexico, etc. An interesting one, I did a series about the Scots in Scandinavia, and I was talking to a historian in Gothenburg, and he told me about the first game of association football in Gothenburg, around about 1892. And he said it was boys from an English firm and boys from a Scottish firm who made lace curtains. And it didn't dawn on me at the time until I got home. Then I thought, lace curtains? And I checked. In the history of New Mills, the village next door to Galston, by a pal called James Mayer, there was the story of Johnston Shields and Company in New Mills, a lace weaving company, who opened factories in Gothenburg and established a Fitba team there and introduced Fitba to Gothenburg, and they did the same in Barcelona. Really?
And Barcelona is fantastic because there's a chapter in the book about this, and there's photographs of the medals that the Scots won in I think it's the Copa Macaya, the Macaya Cup in Barcelona. And what happened was the Scots team It's called the Escossaise FC, Scotland Football Club, and there's a photograph I've got. And they established football. And then as football took off in Catalonia, the big teams started poaching the Scots Works team. So in one of the first derbies between Barcelona, FC Barcelona, and I think it was Espanyol, there's 3 boys from New Mills playing in one team and 2 boys from Darvel or Goston playing in the other team, all from this Works team. Again, it sounds like fantasy football, but it's totally true and it's fantastic.
It is a fantastic story, and all of that is in the book.
It's in the Scottish World. Yeah, there's a chapter on football in the Scottish World.
Well, I've ordered my copy, but because of Amazon's pandemic difficulties, it's on its way. But so I'm looking.
I think there'll be copies in by the weekend. I was told that some people were on furlough and it was shut down for a week or something like that. But anybody who's interested can get hold of any of these books, they can email me from my website, and I've got copies myself. Because of all these gigs or these talks being cancelled because of the pandemic, I've got a wheen of books.
I wish I ordered it from Amazon. Not to worry. See, I need to point out to the folks in the audience, apparently there was a little bit of technical difficulty at some stage. So if your question hasn't been asked, I'm afraid it's because it didn't make it through. So if you've got a point that you want to put to Billy, feel free to repeat it, okay? And we'll look out for it. It's not because we've ignored your point, it just never got to us. Okay. But thank you for the questions so far. Now, your career includes a spell as a BBC producer, is that right?
That's correct. I became a researcher in talks and features in 1978 or 9 for 1 year. It was a 1-year contract. Wee story behind that is that I fancied, because I studied Scottish literature and language at university. I switched from doing a modern language degree, French and German, to doing Scottish literature mainly. It gave me this kind of crusading zeal to tell other working class folk in Scotland what they'd missed out on because they hadn't been educated in their culture. So the thought of trying to get programmes on the BBC appealed to me. So I applied to them. But it was when I applied it must have been the spring, I think, or early summer of 1978. And I had been at the World Cup finals in Germany in 74. And I would later go to Spain and Mexico supporting the boys in blue, the Tartan Army. And in 1978, I decided I would go to Argentina and support Scotland. And the BBC offered me the job, and I turned it down because I decided I would go to Argentina instead. Thank God, sense prevailed, and I didn't go to Argentina because the thought of being one of Ali's sad bees in Argentina, looking back, I made the right decision. So I worked for the BBC for a year as a researcher, and that gave me the skills in recording audio that eventually I proposed a working class history series called Odyssey. And that was recording working class folk for the background I came from, because I realised that there's a huge gap in Scottish broadcasting, and I wanted to fill it with the characters that I'd grown up with. One early one I recorded was my dad worked in Massey Ferguson in Kilmarnock, and he knew a family who were, apart from the one in Massey Ferguson who earned an honest living, the rest of them were all poachers, and that's how they made their living. They went all over Scotland poaching. I'll not say the name just in case they're still in the game. And the police might be after them to this day, because they probably are. So I'll not say their name, but my dad put me in touch with the patriarch of the clan and asked him if he would do an interview about his life poaching. And he said, yeah, by this time he was about 80. So he decided, he'd been in Berlin several times. he decided the police wouldn't come and get him now, that he was 80. So I recorded this old lad. And the first thing he wanted down on tape was, "I've poached every water in Scotland, son. I, the Queen's water in Balmoral tea." That was his proudest claim. He poached salmon in the water belonging to the Queen in Balmoral. And I gave him the right on salute and loved it. Loved having that kind of radical voice. So that was the kind of thing you get through oral history. Amazing stories like that. And I eventually edited 2 books based on the working class oral history that I did. I can show you one of them, I think.
Oh, Odyssey, yeah.
Odyssey. So Odyssey, Voices from Scotland's Recent Past. It was 2 books then, Polygon of Edinburgh University.
Okay.
Reduced it into 1 book. So a lot of the oral history is written down there.
Okay, that's great. That's super.
They're in the libraries. It's out of print, unfortunately. But just about every library has a copy.
That's good. Oh, that's good to know. We found another question from David McHarg on Facebook, and he's saying, "Hi, Billy. You're going to have to put your economist hat on here, Billy."
Oh my God.
A wee bit of one. Do you think that Scotland, as an independent nation, would have survived economically during COVID-19?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I have total faith in the Scottish people in every aspect of their life. And even to think a thought like that, to me, is just part of the 300 years of questioning oneself that a lot of Scots have. I'm absolutely convinced that with the advantages that we've got getting into independence compared to most countries getting into independence, we would thrive and we would do extremely well. And I think it's by going away from Scotland that you get it in perspective and you see everything that Scotland's got going for it. I think if you don't leave Scotland and you're used to being browbeaten by the media, by the negativity about the country from a lot of the media, then I think it does affect the way people view their country and their culture. And the sooner we get away from it, the better, because I think within 10 years, the whole thing would be normalised and people would say, why the hell did we not do this generations before? Absolutely.
It's interesting because that was a fairly common response when people from Denmark and Scandinavia and Germany and other parts across the continent and elsewhere, when they saw the outcome of the 2014 referendum, so many of them said, why? What the heck are you doing? You know, I mean, you had your chance, the door was open, and you chose to kick it closed. Why? They just didn't understand.
I think that the propaganda machine against it was enormous, and it will be again. So we have to be ready for that, and I'm looking forward to the fray. I'm up for it. I'm at an age where I could just drop everything and concentrate entirely on it, go everywhere in support of it. And it's the most important thing that we can ever do is the next referendum. But it has to be one we can win, because if we don't win it, it'll disappear for generations. It'll not come back for a few generations. So it's important that we win it this time. And I think it's in place for us to win it. I know a lot of people who would have voted no in 2014, who've turned because of Brexit. A lot of them, they're just so scunnered by being taken out of Europe against their will that they've now. People come up to me and say, I would now vote yes. So I think there's enough people moving in that direction, and it's now over 50%. We have to get up to about 60%. And there's a lot of controversy, I know, about whether we need to have the Section 30? Is it Section 30 it's called?
Yeah. Called Section 30.
Section 30, about whether we need that. It would be great to have that. But if it continues this way, that there's no chance of getting it, to me, we have to get into an election with the SNP saying, right, if you vote for us, we are going to have independence and or a referendum, and nothing can stop us. And if we got a big enough majority for that, nothing could stop that. So they would have an excuse in the past by saying it wasn't on the ballot paper that if you voted for SNP, you're voting for independence. For example, here in North East Fife, some people voted for a great candidate like Stephen Gettins, who unfortunately got put out by the Liberal Democrats. Now, some people who voted for Stephen gave him a personal vote, and they might not have supported Scottish independence. So, but if he had stood, if candidates state that we will negotiate for independence if you vote for us, then that's an honest position, and that's what we should go for in the next Scottish election, for example.
Yeah. We've had, this is a slightly different question that's come in from Rosie on Facebook. She says, "Hi, Billy." And this time you have to put your European hat on as opposed to your economics hat. Do you think Scotland will be able to rejoin the EU after independence?
Almost instantly. The goodwill that exists for Scotland now across Europe is phenomenal. I mean, my wife's Portuguese, so I know a big section of Portuguese society now. And Nicola Sturgeon is just about a household name in Portugal now. And they admire her tremendously, and they admire the Scottish cause tremendously. And everyone knows that we voted 62% to stay in Europe, and they are all rooting for us now. So there is no question, as soon as we could be allowed back in, we would be allowed back in. And there would be thunderous applause in Strasbourg and in Brussels and everywhere the Parliament sits when the Scottish deputies go into that Parliament. And I long for that day. I've got children across Europe. I've got a son in Zurich, I've got a daughter in Brussels, and I've got another daughter in London. And they all support Scottish independence, and they all want to be proud citizens of an independent Scotland. They're lucky in that because João is Portuguese, they can take out Portuguese citizenship and continue working in Europe, unlike a lot of people. But what they want is what I want too, which is Scottish citizenship as well. And I'm sure that'll come within the next decade. The furthest out I would say would be a decade, but I think it'll occur within the next 5 years, 3 to 5.
I mean, there's a variety of ways of looking at this, and I've got another question coming in, so I won't go there. If we get a chance, we've only got about 12 minutes to go, but we might come back to that. The questioner is asking, Billy, you talk about history and culture. What's your opinion on the defacing of and removal of historical statues and monuments?
Yeah, if as was the case in Bristol, the man was a slave trader, then yes, I think there's a good justification for removing it. Although, I think if you remove it, you remove the history and you remove knowledge of that history. And what will replace it will be nothing about the slave trade. Whereas if you keep it and put around it the explanation of what he did and the horrors of the slave trade, that's maybe a more powerful way to treat that. Talk about changing the names of Buchanan Street and Jamaica Street, etc. in Glasgow. I wouldn't do that. I would explain the history of it and how Scotland profited, like most European countries, from the slave trade. Huge amount of Scots in Jamaica, for example. So I wouldn't erase the history, but I'll just make people more and more aware of that history. For people who are interested in that, if I can make a mention of, there's a very good website on YouTube, a YouTube channel called Indie Matters, INDYMATTERS, Indie Matters. And he's managed to put up a lot of my programs there. And one of them is Scotland's Black History. And it's a 6 or 7 part series I made back in 2003. And then did an add-on in about 3 years ago. So if you're interested in that subject, all of Scotland's black history, literally black and white and very negative, and occasional rays of positivity are in that series, and you can listen to them anytime, as is programs like the declaration of both my recent programs. They're all there on YouTube.
Yeah, we've got a whole bunch of questions coming in now, but I'd just like to add a comment of my own, if I may. I think there was almost two sides to the slave trade. The Scots weren't always the practitioners. They were sometimes the victims. I remember driving through Barbados and coming across a couple of little villages in which people were very pallid.
Yeah. And
one kid was running about with red hair, and I thought, this is really weird. And it seemed that at one time Scots were imported into Barbados as slaves.
They weren't slaves. They weren't slaves, and there is a distinction. And people, it's a very important distinction. They were indentured servants. In other words, they were like slaves for 7 years, but then they got their freedom. They were the red shanks. They were usually some Covenanters, some Jacobites who were captured in the 17th century, and then I think in the early 18th century as well, and sold into servitude for 7 years in the plantations. In some cases before the transatlantic slave trade took over, but it was a 7-year thing. It wasn't a lifetime. So there's a myth about Scottish slaves, and even an even bigger myth about Irish slaves all over America. And you white racists saying, the Irish were slaves, we were slaves, so why can't African American people get on the way we did? And it's a total myth, and it's totally insulting to the history of people who were enslaved. And we were part of that too in Jamaica, but it was normal. This is the thing that people don't quite get. It was totally normal for about 2 centuries, almost 2 centuries. Slavery was an everyday feature of life. So you have to keep it in perspective.
I mean, that form of slavery, true, but I mean, the Romans had slaves, and I think the Greeks had slaves, and so there's a long, and I guess in China and elsewhere,
yes,
I mean, there was a long and dishonourable history of abusing other people, I suppose. So a question has come in from Kevin on Facebook, and he's asking, Billy, are there any historical Scottish books that you would like to see turned into films?
Oh, wow. Thousands.
We've only got.
If I see another film of Elizabeth I, oh my God. There, Don Roberto, R.B. Cunningham Graham, Scottish aristocrat, mixed Scottish and Spanish heritage, spoke Spanish, went for his gap year to Argentina at the age of, I think it was 16 or 17, joined the Revolutionary Army, became a gaucho for 7 years, came back to Britain, was the first socialist MP in Westminster, called it a palace of incapables, Westminster. He founded the Labour Party in Scotland with Keir Hardie on strong home rule credentials. And then he realised the error of his ways there. In the early 1930s, he founded the National Party of Scotland, the forerunner of the SNP, and became the president of the SNP. What a life. Died in Argentina in 1936. I mean, you couldn't make up that man's life. He ran horses chased by the Apaches in Texas. You can make a series, a Netflix 6-hour series on Don Roberto's life. And you probably will not until we're independent, because he was the founder of the SNP, and a lot of people want to hide that history.
I tell you, one movie I'd love to see made is the story of John Law.
Absolutely.
The guy who rustled up the whole idea of the Louisiana Purchase. And
I quoted him recently, because an interesting story there is that John Law of Lauriston, he convinced the French. He became Contrôleur Général de la France and became the main financier in France in the early 18th century, and convinced them to buy Louisiana and Mississippi. So that's why French is spoken in Louisiana to this day. But another fascinating story is 3,000 miles to the north of Louisiana, you've got Nova Scotia and Cape Breton. And you've got Highland Scots going into Cape Breton. Gaelic is still spoken there. And pushing the French And eventually, a lot of the French, realizing that the British were taking over Canada, did a big folk migration after a couple of generations from Nova Scotia down to Louisiana, where their name, which was Acadien, they're from Acadie, which is the French for Cape Breton. Acadie Acadien becomes Cajun. So Cajun music is a mixture of what they brought from Cape Breton, which was Scottish, which was French, and which was mixed in with the local culture of Louisiana. So there's another amazing. We may have invented Cajun music as well. So there you go.
A sort of musical gumbo of this.
Absolutely. Gumbo yaya.
Yeah. So you foresee that independence will come fairly soon. There's an interesting. I developed a little bit of it in the Sunday National last week in the Constitution column, because I wanted to take a look at the other factors which may have a big bearing on the outcome. And we tend to see the independence concept through Scottish eyes quite reasonably. But you could also see it through other eyes. You could see it through end of empire, that sort of focus.
Yeah.
Empires historically tend to implode. In other words, they fall apart from the inside rather than through outside forces so much. And you can almost see a sort of recipe for that happening as far as Britain's concerned, because you've got the three factors coming along now: the pandemic, you've got Brexit in midwinter. These two things taken together would overtax the ablest minds, frankly. In addition to that, we could well have a financial crash similar to 2008, because some of the American banks are deeply indebted on very dodgy loans. So these three whammies, if you like, would likely collapse almost any country if it was extremely well managed. And right now, there isn't a lot of good management around in London. So there might well be two elements running concurrently. A growing pressure inside Scotland, but pressures coming on the UK from mismanagement. Which would be the classic way that empires fall apart in many respects.
We, and in some ways, we are the last colony, the last one to go. We supposedly joined the Union of Free Will, but of course it wasn't. It was an aristocratic parliament that joined. There was riots in the streets of Edinburgh when it happened. The bells of St Giles played a tune, "Why Am I So Sad on My Wedding Day," on the day that the Union was passed. And that tells the story. So it's time to redress that wrong. One thing I would say to people out there is keep the heat. Keep a calm sough. Don't swear at folk on Twitter. Don't rile them. The people will have to convert. By convincing them of the justness and the rightness of our cause, not by insulting them. As I say, the people that I've seen turn around are the kind of people who will not be impressed by being insulted and called a no-bag or stuff like that. I can see why people are frustrated at times and want to use language like that, but far better to convince quietly. And call out the charlatans by all means, but we have another 6 or 7% of people to switch to get that 60% that we need. So Cockani, folks, is coming yet for all that.
There you are. That's the best advice you can ever get. Cockani, it's coming yet for all that. Thank you very much. A big, big thank you. Our time's almost up, Billy, and a big thanks to you. Every bookshelf ought to have copies of Billy's books. You can see them down the front here. He's mentioned a couple of others which are available in libraries, and you should also go to Indie Matters and get sight of his programs, which are contained there as well. And as soon as the pandemic is over, rush to your local bookshop as soon as the restrictions are free and get your own copies. Big thank you to Billy, and a big thank you to all of you. I hope you've enjoyed the show. I certainly have. I thought Billy has told us things that I didn't even dream of about our own culture and heritage, our mother tongue, and also about the diaspora. Please support Indie Live and Indie Live Radio. It's terribly, terribly important. People keep telling us we want new voices for a new Scotland. Well, this is it. This is it. Right? It doesn't get £300 million a year, and it doesn't have over 1,000 employees like the BBC in Scotland. It relies so much on you. So this is your chance to put something back. And if you've enjoyed the TNT show and Billy tonight, that's a terrific vehicle. Go right there and donate to Indie Live.